Welcome to another mod with me, where we will cultivate a creative connection to the decks in my collection. Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today we're going to be trimming and edging the World Spirit Tarot. The World Spirit Tarot is a deck that I did quite a bit of work with at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and it is a lovely, bright and bold multicultural deck, and I absolutely love this glorious artwork. It is very much a Rider-Waite-Smith inspired deck, but as the creator mentions in the guidebook, it's sort of a retelling or a reimagining of that world, and it's set within this bright and beautiful multicultural landscape, which I just absolutely love. So as beautiful as this deck is, I do have some trouble working with it because it is quite a large tarot. It's actually closer to oracle size, and it makes it hard for me to get my hands around it. In particular, it makes it difficult for me to shuffle. And as I've mentioned before in other videos, if I can't shuffle a deck in a way that is very meditative and mindful, then it makes it hard for me to do my readings with a deck, because that is how I actually go about the process of connecting with my deck. And I've mentioned this in other mod videos that I've done. And this deck also has some pretty glossy, slippery cardstock, which also makes it a bit hard to hang on to. But I really love these beautiful bold images, and I really enjoy working with the deck. It's just physically hard for me to get my hands around, to hang on to, and to shuffle in a way that works for me in the way that I go about my readings. So what we are going to do with this beautiful bold deck today is to actually just take it down to a little bit smaller size. So I did think about, and I have thought about, how I want to go about trimming this. And most of the time when I do a deck modification, I'm not just sort of willy-nilly cutting into my cards, although it may seem that way sometimes. There is quite a bit of thought and planning that goes into each deck mod. I think about what I need to change about the deck, because most of the time, modifying a deck for me is more about changing the way it physically works for me than it is aesthetic anymore. Sometimes I do take borders off just for aesthetic, but 9 times out of 10, it's to make a deck smaller and easier for me to work with, or to make it shuffle better for me. So I always like to think about what I'm going to do with the deck. What about it is not working for me? Why do I want to modify it? And how am I going to modify it in a way that actually enhances my use of the deck? So my goal today is basically to trim this deck down, make it something smaller, something that I can work with a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and get started. So in my last mod with me, I actually used a little triangle ruler to create a border or a guideline to help me keep my cards lined up. Last time we were working with a round deck when we did the archetypes deck, and it worked so well and helped things go so much quicker that I thought we would try it on just a normal deck, and to see if that creating a guide over here to help keep my cards in place helps make the process go a little bit quicker. So I thought we would give it a try this time. So as with all of my deck mods, I'm going to basically do one side at a time. Now for this particular deck, I'm actually going to do the bottoms last, because I'm still a little bit, I'm pretty sure I want to go borderless, but I want to see it without the top and the 2 sides first before I decide to take off that last side. So sometimes when I have questions about whether or not I'm actually going to want to do something like that, I like to just kind of do that step last so that I can take my time and really figure out what I want to do with the deck. So to start with, basically what we're going to do is figure out where we want to make our first cut. And what I'm going to do for this particular one, because I do want to get it down as small as I can, but I'm a little concerned that these images are not 100% in the same spot, because they usually aren't on a deck, although they look like they might be pretty close on this one. And then I also need to keep in mind the backs, which may or may not line up with the cards on the front. So basically what I want to do is kind of figure out, where do I want to make this first cut? How much do I want to cut off? So the card is 3.5 inches. In general, I tend to take 1/4 inch off. And I can tell for this particular deck, that's not going to get me quite as close to the edge as I want, and it might retain some semblance of a black border. So for this particular deck, we might need to just leave somewhat of a black border. Although if I move it in another centimeter or so, I can get pretty close to that same edge. But again, the cards aren't 100% printed in the exact same spot, so that's going to make it a little bit more difficult, of course. So for this one, I'm going to use my ruler to kind of show me where that first cut is going to be. And yeah, the printing is definitely a little bit skewed, but I think if you look at the cards, I think that's actually intentional because the back is that way as well. It kind of looks like it's been, you know, plopped down on there. I think this is lino art. I could be wrong, but I think it's like block art. And so that makes sense that it would look like it's been plopped down there. And so that is kind of a little bit where my concern comes in. I don't want to detract from that, but I do need to make this deck smaller. So maybe what we'll do is just go to the inside of this first border, and we'll just go ahead and leave a little bit of the black around the edge. I think that'll work just fine as well. Again, my intention is mostly to make this a smaller deck. If it happens to come out 100% borderless, that's great too, but if not, I'm okay with that. So I think we'll go ahead and make our first cut there. So that's taking off 1/4 inch. So I'm going to use my little ruler, or my little triangle ruler here, and see if I can make a guide over here that will help me keep everything lined up and in place. Let's go ahead and get cutting. So that's going to put me right here, and just so that we can see, where's that going to leave my back? That is going to leave my back pretty well borderless, although I'm wondering if I might end up with more over here on the other side, but I usually don't concern myself too much with the backs. I'm more concerned about the images on the front. And so it looks like I'm nice and lined up. So we're gonna go ahead and just cut that first 1/4 inch off of the whole right side of the deck. And as you can see here, that did retain that black, a little bit of a black border around it, but I think that's actually going to work okay for this deck. So I'm just going to go through and repeat this process, and I'm just going to cut that 1/4 inch off those cards. You see here, this time it got closer to this side, but again, that's okay because all my cards will be the same size because I'm using these measurements. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this side off, and then we'll come back and check back in. Okay, so I have finished trimming off the right side of the deck, and oh my goodness, that went so fast with this guide, and look how straight they all are. Like, they're pretty close. I think maybe towards the end I got some slippage because you can see it's closer here than it is on the other side. But hopefully I can fix that a little bit when I go to the other side. But oh my goodness, 5 minutes, you guys. That took me 5 minutes. I don't think I've ever trimmed one whole side of a deck in 5 minutes. So definitely loving this technique so far. Might have to keep using that. So basically, now that I've done the right side, I flipped my deck around, and I'm going to do the other side because like I said, I'm going to leave my bottom for the last. So I'm going to do my sides first. And we're going to take off probably another 1/2 inch on this, or 1/4 inch, not a half, 1/4 inch on the other side. So that's going to put me at the 3 mark. So we're just going to lift all my little washi up and move this over. Make sure I am lined up straight, and I'm trying to keep my washi out of the way of my cards so it doesn't impede anything. Okay, so that is in place. And we're looking like we're pretty straight there. And again, even if I'm not 100% straight, all of my cards are going to be cut at this same spot on this side. So they will all come out the same whether or not I'm slightly off one way or the other. This time I'm going to push down a little bit further, a little bit harder on the bottom down here, because I think the blade along with the slick cardstock is kicking the cards around a little bit. So try to get that a little bit straighter. So there's our two sides gone, and already liking that. It's a nice difference. So I'm going to go ahead and do my usual and make sure that my blade is completely up. And this is popping up for some reason. So I guess we're just going to have to use some washi there. Try and tack this down a little bit better. It's kind of popping up and the washi's getting in my way. Okay. Because I want to make sure that my card doesn't slide underneath it. And check those two. And they look great. So I'm going to keep on with this process and we'll be back hopefully in another 5 minutes. All right, so now I have cut the other side off, and here's what our deck's looking like so far. And already I can tell you this is a better size. Closer to actual probably tarot size now that we've taken those big borders off. So now what we're gonna do is go ahead and basically repeat the process, flip things around, and I'm gonna take the tops off and we're gonna save those bottoms for the end. So that takes the tops off, and that's what we've got. So I think this would actually work a lot better. Just like this. We might have to take a look at this back and see what we can do. Maybe I decide to keep the titles. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what I end up doing. But for now, I'm going to finish taking these tops off. So hopefully I'll see you again in another 5 minutes. So I finished trimming the first 3 sides of this deck, and I do have to say that it looks pretty good like this. I actually don't even mind the colored border at the bottom or the little colored line, because it actually works quite well with the deck and the colors match. However, I just think that this deck would look phenomenal with no text on it, just these big beautiful images. And so I am going to go ahead and take the titles off and the border at the bottom, just because this deck is so recognizable in its imagery that I don't think I'm going to have any problem reading with it without the titles on it. And the cards are in the guidebook, so there's the little black and white version of the cards in the guidebook. So if I was to come across a card that I didn't know what it was, I could always look it up in the guidebook. And so for all of those reasons, I am going to go ahead and take the titles off, because I think it's going to look really, really fantastic just down to this beautiful artwork. But I think that it works just as well like this. You could round the corners, and this would also make for a beautiful deck of cards as well. But I love a deck that is just artwork with as little titles on it or as little text on it as possible. So I'm going to take it down to that artwork. So now I need to reset. I can't exactly use my 1/4 inch marks at this point, because now I am dealing with a bigger space. So I want to take off the colored border at the bottom. So I'm just going to find on here where on my board that's going to get me that border cut off. And it's looking like probably about there. And I'm not on a line, which is never fabulous, but so it's looking like maybe about there. And of course I just moved it because I want to get some washi here. what I want to see is what the back is going to look like. So right now the back's actually not looking too bad. I mean, I've got a little bit cropped off the top and it is a little in there skewed, but again, this is like a wood stamped or wood, I forget what they call it, wood block, I think. And so I'm okay with it being a little bit askewed because I think it works really well that way. So if I were to cut it right where my mark is at the moment, I would end up taking off, and of course my washi is twisted and getting in the way. Okay, so if I were to take that off, I'm going to end up basically cutting into this image here. So it's going to end up looking like this basically, which is probably fine because you really can't tell what it is. What I'm curious is if I go right here and I just cut this little design off on the bottom, what's that going to do to the top of my cards? So that would put me, let's just go ahead and use this one. So if I went right here and I trimmed the whole bottom emblem off, that's gonna put me into the bottom of my images. And what I'm just wondering is if I really want to do that. I really hate when I have to cut into the images. So I think what I'm going to do for this particular deck is I think I'm not going to worry about the back. I'm going to just go ahead and let there be a little bit of that bottom imagery showing, because I'd rather have the fronts be where I need them to be. So that puts me about right. And there's our cut, taking off that bottom, and you can see that I've got the little tops of the emblems there on the bottom. And again, that's okay. I probably could have adjusted my top a little bit more, but I'm okay with it being like this. I think it's gorgeous, and I think it's gonna work wonderful. I mean, look how beautiful that image is. And of course, I know that's the 9 of Pentacles. Knowing a deck really well also helps you to be able to just go ahead and, you know, trim those titles off and work with it. It also opens the deck up to be able to work with a bit more intuitively, because you don't necessarily have the titles and those more traditional keywords kind of that we get locked into, and sometimes taking off the Lover's title, even though I look at this card and I know it's the Lover's, but there's something in the brain that when I see the titles, it makes me kind of tap back into the kind of the more traditional sense, like basically, you know, what I've been taught, what I've read in books. And sometimes that limits my intuitive ability to work with a deck. So I like taking titles off whenever I can. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up taking the titles off all of these. Then I'm going to go ahead and round the corners, and we'll come back and take a look at colors. But look at how these are coming so far. Aren't these just beautiful images? Love it. Okay, I'm going to finish this up and then we'll be back. Okay, so I am just finishing up corner punching this deck. So I'm using my Katamaro Pro Corner Punch. I'm using the medium setting, which I believe is 5 millimeters. I could be wrong though. So just going around, punching all the corners, and then we get this lovely rounded corners. And here is my completely trimmed deck. Look how beautiful they look. Yeah, this is just gorgeous. This makes me happy. I think it makes me happy every time I modify a deck. And then here's what the backs look like. Let's pull it up. So we do have the little bit of the emblems on the bottom, but you can't even really tell what they are. So I think it works just fine. Again, like I said, I'm not too terribly concerned with the back, but at least it's a size now that I can actually get my hand around. So for this edging, whoops, knocking everything over, I bought a new set of these thinner markers, and mostly just because it had a nice big variety. Oh, maybe I can bring it in here. So this is what I bought. It's the super tips. They are washable markers. So that does mean that they wipe off the glossy cards really well. There has been a bit of discussion in a lot of groups and some chats and comments on videos and things of that nature that, you know, Crayola is a washable marker. So therefore, it does make sense that if your hands get kind of damp or sweaty or just, you know, the oils on your hands or whatever, it can rub the marker off. And that's just, you know, it does track. It does make sense. For the most part, I've not experienced that too bad. A lot of times I run a distress stamp over the edge, and that kind of does help to seal it in. And that might be something I do this time, but I like to wait and see how the colors turn out before I decide if I do that. It does definitely seem to be a issue with more of the blacks and the navies and the reds, those really dark colors. Does seem to be a little bit more. They do eventually stop, in my experience, rubbing off in the few decks that I've had that issue with. And to be perfectly honest, there's only been a few decks that I've had that issue with, because the majority of my decks that I've done in Crayola are holding up beautifully. And I think a lot of that also has to do with the cardstock itself and how well it absorbs the ink and how well it allows the ink to dry. And those are things that just vary from deck to deck. So I think I do mention this every time I bring out the Crayola markers in every video, but just in case you haven't seen any of the other ones, I just do want to mention that there is a possibility for these markers to rub off on your hand, you know, for a little while, potentially indefinitely, because they are washable markers. I do find that the regular washable markers seem to hold up better than the ones that say super clean on them. So I do have a few of the fatter markers, the broad tip markers, that say ultra clean, I think, and those ones do tend to rub off a bit more, and those ones I use only when I'm going to be using a distressed ink over the top of it to kind of help usually change the color a little bit, but also to seal it in. Okay, so enough about markers. Today I'm going to be using some of these new markers. You know, I got this pack and I just thought I'd give it a try. I'd seen some other people use it. It's not a terribly big broad tip, but you know, it's about the size of a Sharpie, so that should work. You know, speaking of markers, Sharpie can rub off on your hands too. The reds and blues, I think, are notorious for that. I don't use Sharpie because I don't like the smell. It gives me a terrible, terrible headache, and it always bleeds on my cards. I've never used Sharpie that hasn't bled on my cards. So I gave up on Sharpies quite a long time ago, and that's the reason I've explored other markers. Sometimes I use art markers, but I do like the Crayolas whenever I can do it, because it really does ruin your marker to edge a deck with it. It'll end up all chewed up and chunked up, and it does wear the marker out pretty quickly. So I like to use the less expensive markers. Occasionally, if I'm looking for a particular color, I'll use an art marker, but for the most part, if I can use a Crayola, that's what I'm going to go with, because it's cheaper, it's easy for me to replace. I can grab it at any store, like the grocery store even. I can grab a pack of markers if I need, whereas the art markers, I have to actually go to the arts and crafts stores to buy those. And, you know, they tend to be a couple of dollars per marker. So for $10, I can buy, you know, a pack of 50 of the Crayolas and get this wide variety of colors. So, okay, I said I was done talking about markers. Now I truly am. So I'm going to use, I like to do a variety of colors when I can. And a lot of times I chunk up the deck according to their suits. So a lot of times I'll do the suit association. So I'll do blue for cups and green for pentacles, yellow for swords, and red for wands, and purple for my majors. And that tends to be the color association I use. And I do that in a lot of decks. But sometimes when I have a deck like this, I tend to just like to kind of group them up by colors. Although I think that the color association would probably work. However, like this is a cup card, which traditionally I would do in a blue, but there's not a lot of blue on this. It is a very yellow card. So this one I'm going to edge in yellow. Basically what I do is I set my markers out and I just make piles. So I go, this one's got a lot of blue. This one has a lot of blue, but I know it's a pentacle and I like the green, especially with it being an ace. This one has a lot of red. This one has a lot of purple. And so I basically just go through here and I, group them up by colors. And then I will balance them out if need be, because I don't want any one color to have too many cards in it. So once I actually get them all kind of grouped up into what I want to put them in, then we'll take a look at what I do from then on. So now I have divided them all up basically based on the color that I saw on the card or the color that stood out to me on the card. So now I'm just going to go through and count them and make sure that I have a fairly even number so they don't get any weighted one color heavier than the other. So now it's just a matter of going through and edging the deck. So I'm going to move the cards out of the way, keep my piles so that nothing gets in my way. I've got my little paper towel and I've got my marker. Now one of the good things about doing it in groups like this is that oftentimes with really most of the time with any color, you usually have to do 2 coats to get a nice dark and even coverage. So doing them in small chunks like this, it just seems to make it a little bit easier, a little bit better. It's like you're not doing quite so many cards at one time. I think it's just a trick of the brain because you are actually doing the same number of cards. If you do 78 cards and you have to do 2 coats, then you have to do them twice. So I think it's just a little trick of the brain that it's not quite so many. I am using my paper towel to just run along the edge to take off any excess. And it's better to get the excess off and have to do a second coat than to do a heavier first coat, because the thicker your coat, the longer it takes to dry, and the more you're going to get transfer. So it's better to do 2 kind of thinner coats than one really thick one. So I'm just keeping always with the back of the card towards me so that if there is any bleed, it goes onto the back of the card, not the front. However, with Crayolas, you usually don't get bleed. It's very minimal, if at all. And if you do get bleed, especially on this glossy cardstock, it usually comes right off. So I'm going to finish up edging this deck, and then we will come back and take a look at the final product. I finished edging this beautiful deck, and so here we have all of the red cards. You see it's the beautiful red color. I did do 2 coats on this entire deck, so that way I got a nice bright bold color, well filled in. I have the yellow, which actually turned out more orange, but I'm okay with that. It looks beautiful on here. Have the blue green that I used. The green, regular green, and the purple. And I think overall the colors match really well. Let's bring them in. So look how beautiful those are. Let's take a look at the beautifully trimmed images now. I love that they're borderless. They just look gorgeous. I just love this artwork. So bold and beautiful. Kind of reminds me of the Tarot of the She. A little bit of the Tarot of the Trees. Got that same kind of feel. I bet those decks would all look really great together. I might have to give that a try. So now that we've got them all done, let's go ahead and give them a shuffle. See how they shuffle. Get them mixed in. So they don't rifle shuffle really well, but I still can rifle shuffle them. This is a newer deck, so I imagine as I shuffle it more, it will give a little bit more. It does overhand beautifully, which is nice. Let's get a good mix in there. Now let's bring them back in. Now we can see Got that beautiful variegated colors, which I think looks really great with all of the beautiful bright colors that we have in the deck. You can see them on the side there. Yeah, I think they came out really, really well. I'm really pleased with it. Let's lay a few of them down just so we can see how they look borderless. I've got some of them flipped around. Sometimes as I'm edging, I don't get things flipped back around the correct way, but yeah, there they are. Aren't they beautiful? So I'm really pleased with the way that this turned out. I think it looks fantastic, and I really do like them borderless. Again, it's very much a Waite-Smith inspired deck, so I don't think I'm going to have any trouble reading it without the titles on it, and I love the way it looks like this. And of course, it's a much better size for me to handle. Thank you for joining me for this mod with me. You will find links for the decks and products that I have used in this video in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this process and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.